Okay, good morning, everybody. I apologize for the delays in getting classes to you, but I'm going to try my best to record as much as I can today. But if you'll forgive this croaky voice and occasional breaks for me to go off and hack and cough and blow my nose, we'll get on with this as well as we can. And by the end of the weekend, we'll be caught up. I know this places a responsibility on all of you to follow up by following these recorded classes instead of having in-class meetings. But nonetheless, hopefully by Monday we'll be back on track. Okay, so we're carrying on our discussion about the evolution of the plants. And we come now to the evolution of the seed plants. Remember that what we have discussed up until now were the non-vascular plants, mosses, etc. And then the vascular plants, which do not produce seeds, which are the ferns and all of their allies. Now we're going to talk about vascular plants, which do produce seeds. And we're going to learn the importance of the seed in its function, but also its evolutionary importance. It was a huge, huge advance in the evolution of plants, but also in the evolution of the planet, because it allowed the penetration of plants so deep into the terrestrial environment that they could modify the environment for the penetration of the animals thereafter. Okay, so the evolution of the seed actually transformed the structure, the biogeography of the planet. And the seeds originated about 360 million years ago. And the definition of a seed is that it is an embryo, plant embryo, surrounded by nutrients with a protective coat around it. That protective coat prevents the seed, the embryo, from drying out, and it allows the embryo to be transported far from the parent plant. So those are two huge advantages that are conferred on a plant by the evolution of the seed. And the seed plants in general share other characteristics as well. The first is, remember what we said in discussing the non-seed plants. First of all, we saw that in the mosses and their allies, in the really primitive plants, the Gametophyte is the dominant plant, and the Sporophyte is parasitic and temporary on the Gametophyte. In the vascular plants, that situation is reversed. And instead, the Gametophyte is a small, short-lived plant, and the Sporophyte is still parasitic on the Gametophyte, but the Gametophyte actually dies. And the Sporophyte grows as a long-lived plant, and maybe a very large plant, as we saw in the ferns and things like that. In the Carboniferous, they could be very large and form actually forests, but they were tied still to the aquatic environment in a way, because they require the presence, they require the presence of water in order for fertilization to occur. Now in the vascular seed plants, we see a complete change. Instead, the Sporophyte that is absolutely the dominant and maybe extremely long-lived, maybe thousands of years old. And the Gametophytes are reduced to microscopic proportions. And in addition, we'll see that the Gametophytes are the product of two different kinds of spore. They are the Megaspore, which is going to produce the female egg, and then the male Gametophyte, which is so reduced that it is microscopic and can be dispersed, often as pollen. And the male gametophyte is enclosed within that spore. So they are both microscopic, but the egg is much larger than the pollen. So the egg spore, the Megasporangium is what we call it, is much larger than the spore containing the male gametophyte, which we call the Microsporangium. Now the eggs, in addition, are housed in a special covering, in a special organ with a covering around it, which is called the ovule. So the structure containing the egg is the ovule. And the return to the idea of the pollen. Pollen is a huge advance because it enables it frees the plants, the seed plants rather, it frees them from dependence on water. The plants no longer need water for sperm to swim through because the pollen can be dispersed. It can be widely dispersed either by wind, as commonly happens, or by animals. And the pollen goes to the egg. It does not require water for the sperm, which are contained within the pollen, to get to the egg. Instead, the pollen goes to the egg and fertilizes it. We'll see exactly how this happens in a while. And just remember now, get the idea in your head that what you see before you see the trees around you, you see the flowering plants, etc. Those are all long-lived sporophytes, but they contained within their reproductive organs, there are spores which are microscopic, which are actually the gametophytes. Okay, so here's just a run through again, just to remind you. In the mosses, the green part here can be relatively long-lived, that is gametophyte, and it is haploid. And the gametophyte produces gametes, male and female. They need water for fertilization, but once fertilization occurs, they produce a 2N or diploid sporophyte, which is parasitic on the gametophyte. In the seedless vascular plants, they still have a gametophyte, a separate gametophyte plant, but the gametophyte is reduced, short-lived. It has male and female gametes. It still needs water for fertilization to occur because the sperm are motile and need to swim to the egg. But the fertilization produces a sporophyte, a diploid sporophyte with specialized areas called the sporangia, which are going to, by meiosis, produce spores, which in turn produce the new gamete, the new gametophyte generation. The seed plants, however, it is the sporophyte which is absolutely dominant and may be very long-lived, and it has areas in the plant where meiosis is going to take place, where spores are going to be produced, but the spores are microscopic. So if you look, there are two great seed-bearing plant lines. They are in a clade, but they are quite distinct from one another. The first are the Gymnosperms, and the Gymnosperms produce their spores in their gametophytes in a specialized organ called the cone. So there are large female cones here, and those female cones, which are diploid, they're sporophytes, they contain the gametophytes, and the gametophyte is microscopic and is produced by meiosis. So it is N. Same here, the male gametophytes are produced in cones, but they look quite different to the female cone. And they are, again, microscopic, and they produce pollen. and this is referred to as a pollen cone. Those two, the male gametophytes, ultimately produce sperm. The female gametophyte produces an egg, and those are fertilized one another and produce the new sporophytes, which you see here. But you never see a separate gametophyte plant because it's entirely dependent on the sporophyte. Same for the flowering plants. They have microscopic female gametophytes and microscopic male gametophytes. And we're going to see exactly how this works in a while. In addition, I must warn you that in the flowering plants or the angiosperms, the process of fertilization is quite complicated. In the gymnosperms, it is relatively simple, but there is an elaboration on the fertilization process in the angiosperms, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so excuse me. So you can see, again, to remind you, a characteristic of all the seed plants is that they are heterosporous. They produce large Megasporangium, produces large megaspores that give rise to the female gametophyte. And they have small Microsporangia, which produce microspores that give rise to the male gametophyte. So here's in the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms, as I told you, have a relatively more simple fertilization process and a relatively more simple structure that contains the megaspores. Here's the structure here. Here's a cone cut through, and you'll see that there are leaves, if you like. There's specialized leaves here, which contain the female parts of the plant. And if we look here, we take this here, and we're going to have a look at that. Here it is the entire structure, and the entire structure is called an ovule. And in the gymnosperms, it only has one covering around it, and that is the integument. Now, keep track of what is diploid and what is haploid. Anything that's diploid is part of the sporophyte, and its cells reproduce by mitosis. So the integument is diploid, 2N. It contains a Megasporangium. There it is there. It is this large cell structure here. That is the Megasporangium, still diploid. This here is a megaspore, and it is produced by meiosis. It is produced by meiosis by the Megasporangium. And here it is here. It is surrounded by a spore wall there. Here's the nucleus here, and that nucleus is N. It is haploid. At the one end of this ovule, there is a small opening called the micropyle. And the pollen grain contains the male gametophyte. The pollen grain is produced by Microsporangia on the male cone. The pollen grains are released. They are N, they are haploid, and they contain sperm. When they land on the ovule, here we'll see that they actually grow, they germinate, and they produce a pollen tube here through which the sperm is motile. And the sperm moves to the female gametophyte and fertilizes the egg nucleus. So that is 2N. This produces a situation where, in fact, this, if we'll have a look here, this here, all of this tissue here is N. This is the female gametophyte, and it is N. It is haploid. And that female gametophyte is going to grow, is going to expand. The cells are going to start dividing really rapidly. And they surround the growing embryo. This is when once it's fertilized, it forms a zygote, it begins to grow and it forms an embryo. All of this, the remains of the Megasporangium here, are lost. They are actually absorbed as nutrient by the growing female gametophyte. And here it is here. And it is surrounded by a spore wall there. And if you remember, that spore wall contains the substance sapropollenin, which links it to the charophytes, a group of algae. So here is the spore wall surrounding now an abundant female gametophyte tissue, which is haploid, which is called the endosperm. The endosperm is a nutrient source for the embryo once germination occurs. So the entire spore wall may thicken and provide a protective covering around the whole structure. So if you're familiar with pine nuts, you can picture in your mind, this is what we will eat in a pine nut. This is the endosperm, but it contains an embryo. That embryo can remain dormant for some length of time because this seed can be dispersed. It can be dispersed away from the parent plant, and the seed itself is only going to germinate. The embryo is only going to become active and begin to grow into the mature sporophyte once it is in suitable conditions for its growth. Okay, so just track here. Track what is happening with these different types of tissue, whether they are haploid or whether they are diploid. Okay, if they're haploid, they're part of the gametophyte. If they are diploid, they're part of the sporophyte. That's the simple way to think about it. So here's a real reproductive leaf from a cone. And this is a pine cone, probably familiar to you. And what you see in here is a seed, and the seed is formed from the endosperm plus the embryo. So there's our embryo plus our nutrient source, and it is surrounded by a seed coat, which is formed from the spore wall. And then the rest of the structure around here is tissue that was part of the ovule. And this will often form a wing in the gymnosperms. That is so that when the seed is dropped, there is an aerodynamic quality to that wing, and it causes the seed, when it drops, to spiral in the air, not to drop straight down, but to spiral away from the parent plant. Okay, so here's the idea. The seed is developing from a whole ovule, and it's the sporophyte embryo together with a food supply. Usually there are a few specialized seeds where there's no food supply, but we won't worry about those. And then there's a protective coat. That protective coat is what is really critical, because the protective coat prevents desiccation, and it allows for time. It allows time for the seed to be dispersed far from the parent plant, so that the parent and the progeny do not compete with one another. So these seeds can be transported by various means. They can be transported by wind, they can be transported by water, and they can be transported by animals. All of those occur. So the gymnosperms were the dominant form of seed plants for many millions of years. They appear about 305 million years ago. And of course, we still have them around today. But they were dominant for millions of years. And in fact, that is the vegetation which most of the dinosaurs saw. The flowering plants did arise before the loss of most of the dinosaurs, but not much long before. So the Gymnosperms, the pines and all of their allies, they were the plants which colonized far into dry land and modified the land sufficiently that animals could penetrate far away from water sources. The reason for that, of course, they're completely independent of water for fertilization. They're dependent on water, as all living things are, but they have deep root systems and strong root systems which can access underground water. They don't necessarily need surface water in order to survive. And the seeds are resistant to desiccation, so they can be transported to new areas where they can germinate and colonize those areas. They enabled the penetration far into dry land, into what was effectively dry land because it didn't have much surface water. And many of the Gymnosperms, in fact, were adapted to very dry conditions. And we still find Gymnosperms in those kinds of conditions. So the reason that they're Gymnosperm means naked seed. And this is when we have a look here, what we're seeing here is just the ovule itself forming that seed coat. It is this part, it's this here that forms the thick, heavy seed coat, protective seed coat. It's this area here, but we only have that area there. The ovule is not protected in any way apart from the seed coat. Excuse me. Now you're going to see in the flowering plants that there's a great elaboration on this. And the seeds are no longer naked like that. They're actually enclosed far more in more tissue layers, as we'll see in a minute. Where was I? So the group of plants which went on to form the flowering plants, they share common ancestry with the later Gymnosperms. We're not exactly sure of their evolutionary origins, but there are, for example, flowering plants which bear their ovules in a cone, and the most familiar one to all of you should be the Magnolia. If you go and look at the beautiful magnolias, they're in bloom at the moment, and if you look at them carefully, you'll see that they bear their seeds in a cone, and that is a link to their Gymnosperm ancestry. That cone in more advanced flowering plants, the cone structure is actually lost. But the Angiosperms, the flowering plants, were incredibly successful. And the reason for that was that they began to exploit a relationship with animals to effect their fertilization. Now, the Gymnosperms are fertilized by wind. Excuse me. This is going to happen all through this class, so you might as well just get used to it. The Gymnosperms are fertilized by wind. Wind fertilization is efficient, but it requires that a plant put an enormous amount of metabolic energy into the production of pollen, so that those male gametophytes contained within the pollen can be dispersed, and the plant there can be a relative certainty that ovules are going to be fertilized. But you need an awful lot of pollen to make sure that that is going to happen, and that most of the pollen simply goes to waste. So in the flowering plants, the fertilization is most efficiently effected by insects or by other animals. There are angiosperms, there are flowering plants, and many of them that still use wind pollination. But the great advance in the flowering plants was that they developed highly specialized organs called the flower, which were responsible for ensuring that pollination took place efficiently. And they began to dominate the landscape. And they actually began right at the beginning of the Mesozoic, when the dinosaurs were evolving, or had, were reaching their peak. But they did not become really dominant, until after the dinosaurs had largely been wiped out. So let's have a look just at some of the gymnosperms. Let's have a look at some of the different kinds. These are the cycads. You can see these as landscape plants in many, many gardens and plantings. These were one of the dominant forms during the age of the dinosaurs, during the Mesozoic. There are relatively few species left extant on the planet today, but they are extremely widespread. You find them in Africa, in the Pacific, and various other areas as well. You can see here in the center, this is a cone. They have separate plants, separate sporophytes for male and female, and they have separate male and female cones. So here is another, this may look a little bit surprising, that this is actually a gymnosperm, but this is a gymnosperm which you can see all over New York. And this is the beautiful tree ginkgo. It's called Ginkgo biloba. And that is the reason for that is the leaves have 2 lobes to them. This little notch here is not always that obvious. This is a relatively common fossil in the Mesozoic. And here is a fossil leaf here. But the living plants look almost identical. They are almost unchanged. So they're an extremely successful form. They have survived unchanged for many millions of years. Here, they actually have a fruit here. And the fruit is formed from the spore wall, and is a fleshy fruit, which is edible, fully edible, and is very edible for animals. And this is a means of seed dispersal. And you can spot these plants. They have separate male and female. And in cities where they're widely used as landscape plants, they in general try to plant male plants or sterile female plants. But it goes wrong quite frequently. And they end up planting female plants. And you can spot the female plants very, very easily, because when they drop the fruit and it rots on the ground, it smells exactly like vomit. And if you're walking along the city street and you suddenly get that terrible smell of vomit, like somebody's thrown up on the sidewalk, don't blame somebody for vomiting. Just have a look around. You'll probably find a ginkgo tree very nearby with fruit underneath. It is a really revolting smell. That's the reason they try not to plant female plants. They try to plant male plants or sterile female plants. It's a very beautiful tree. And in autumn, this is what it looks like. You can spot them easily. They grow there are some on the road outside the college. And in autumn, they turn this beautiful yellow color, this very vivid yellow. This is another strange group of gymnosperms. And these are called the Ganetophytes. And they have some very, very bizarre plant forms. But some of them actually, you can see here, have leaves very, very similar to the flowering plants. You maybe think that all gymnosperms must all have pine needles. They don't. Some of them actually look have flattened leaves. This one here is called Welwitschia, and it occurs in southern Africa in the Namib Desert. In fact, it only has 2 leaves, believe it or not. These here is 1 leaf there and 1 leaf there, but they carry on growing. They are indeterminate in their growth. They just carry on and on and on and on growing. and the wind whips them up and tears them into these straps that get all wrapped around. But if you look at them, they have ovulate cones. There they are there. And then other plants have male cones, just as the other gymnosperms do. A very bizarre plant. These may be hundreds, if not thousands of years old. The age is difficult to determine, but they are extremely long-lived. Now, the last one I'm going to mention is this one here. This is a Native American plant, and this is Ephedra. And that should ring a bell, because this is the source of ephedrine. And if, as I am busy doing, you take cough and cold medicine, then it is ephedrine, a substance extracted from Ephedra that is included in cough medicine because it acts rather like adrenaline to shrink, to cause blood vessels to contract in your nose and mouth. So that is Ephedra. These are the ones that excuse me. I can't hit the mute button quickly enough. So these are the Gymnosperms, which are probably much more familiar to you. These are the Conifers, the pines, and all of their allies. These you are familiar with. Most of the Gymnosperms have leaves throughout the year. They do not lose their leaves during winter, but some of them are in fact deciduous. And this is, I think this, if I can move this, I believe this is a larch, yes. This is a larch, which is a conifer, which is deciduous. It actually loses its leaves in winter. Most of them do not. Most of them have leaves all year round. So these are familiar fir trees for you probably. The sequoias, the giant sequoias, which are amongst the largest and oldest living organisms on the planet. These are also conifers. This is juniper. Like ginkgo, it has a fruit, a little small fruit like a berry there. And that is commonly used in cooking, but is also used in alcohol production. But this is one of the things that flavors gin and also whiskey. They sometimes use it to flavor whiskey. This is a strange one. This is called Wallamy Pine. Wallamy Pine is a conifer that is very, very, very well known in the fossil record and was believed to have died out around about the same time as the dinosaurs died out, until a living population, a small living population, was discovered in Australia. And here it is here. But it is absolutely identical to fossils found that are millions of years old. The last one here is the bristlecone pine. Bristlecone pines are almost certainly the longest lived plants known, where the age has been proven. And there's a little story about the bristlecone pine. And that is, there was a graduate student in California, I believe, who was working on bristlecone pines. And he got permission to actually cut one down and count the number of rings. Now, you may know that trees lay down annual rings. They actually lay down 2 rings a year, usually. And by counting the rings, you can determine how old the plant is. So he got permission to cut down one of these bristlecone pines. They knew they were very old, but they didn't really know how old. Just give me 1 second. So he cut one down, which was an enormous undertaking, because it turned out it was so hard that it broke most saws. Eventually, I think, had to get a diamond tip saw to cut through it, and began counting the rings. And he had only gone a couple, like an inch or something, and he was already back like several hundred years. So he carried on counting and counting, got further and further and further back in time. And he, in telling the story, said that when he got to around about the time that Jesus was alive, he began to feel rather guilty because he wasn't at the end. The plant in the end, I think, was estimated at about 3,500 years. And this poor chap is absolutely overcome with guilt that he was responsible for killing this organism that had been alive for all of that time on the planet. And since then, of course, they are absolutely fearsomely protected, very, very endangered, though, unfortunately, by global heating. They are under extreme threat. Okay, so here are the pines. Here's the male cones here. They are small, and they are terminal to on the branches usually. Here are the female cones. The female, you may have plants which have both male and female on the same plant, and then there are others where they are entirely separate. Female plants usually born along the branches, not just at the ends. So these are the female plants. These are the ones that contain the megaspores, the ovules rather, which the megaspore is contained in, and those are going to develop into the female gametophytes. The development of these cones may be very slow and take a long time. And this was something of a disadvantage for the Gymnosperms, which is largely overcome in the flowering plants, in the Angiosperms, where development is actually usually quite rapid. So let's see if this works. This is a demonstration of how much, let's see. I'm not sure if you can see this.
If you have allergies, get your meds ready. Just watch
it. Watch.
Video, maybe too much.
It's going to tap the tree.
So
this is a pine tree. Look at this. This is all pollen.
Into a cloud of green when a bulldozer tapped it. When the bulldozer taps the tree, pollen erupts from the leaves so thick that it replicates the tree's shape. The video has been shared tens of thousands of times.
Oh dear. Now I've done something dreadful. Now I've done something dreadful. Let me just see again. I'm sorry. Okay, no, there we go. Gosh, I hope you can see. I really, really hope you can see this. Okay, so let me just run through them. I'm not going to go into all of the detail about the fertilization process, but I just want to point out the salient facts for you. Remember our large trees. These are the mature sporophytes. They produce male and female cones. Here is the male cone here, and these are called the Microsporangia. And the Microsporangia contain in them cells which are going to undergo meiosis. And the Microsporangium is diploid, but its cells undergo meiosis and then mitosis many, many times to produce pollen grains. So the pollen grains are actually haploid, and the pollen grains are spores, and they contain within them the male gametophyte. And that obviously is N. Similarly, the female, here's the female cone. Here's the ovule here. On each leaf, there in the Gymnosperms, there are usually 2 ovules lying side by side to one another. And those are the Megasporangia. They contain the Megasporangium, the Megasporangium, can divide by meiosis to produce a megaspore. And here it is here. And the megaspore ends up being fertilized by the pollen. The pollen lands on it and germinates, produces a pollen tube down which the male sperm swim. And they fertilize the pollen, the egg, and they then form an embryo. Surrounding the embryo is haploid tissue, which grows rapidly to form an endosperm, a food reserve. And surrounding the whole thing is a seed coat, which is produced by the spore coat and by the integument, that part of the ovule which was sheltering the Megasporangium. The rest of the ovule tissue may form a further elaboration, which is often in a wing, which helps disperse the seed. The seed is dispersed away from the parent plant, lands somewhere suitable, and germinates. I'm sorry for this, I'm beginning to lose my voice. All right, so let's now go on to some discussion about the angiosperms. Now, the angiosperms are also seed plants. Obviously, both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms are vascular plants. They have an elaborate vasculature, which is what allows them to grow tall. The angiosperms have specialized reproductive structures. And these are the flowers and the fruits. The flower is specialized for sexual reproduction. The flower is a structure which is specifically designed to attract pollinators. Those flowering plants which are wind pollinated do not have these elaborate structures. It'd be a waste of time. So there are angiosperms which are wind pollinated. They do not have flowers. Instead, the flower itself is an elaborate structure, often highly, highly specialized, and its evolutionary structure has been driven by an interaction between the plant and its pollinators. Some of them are extremely specialized. They only have one pollinator. Others do not. Many of them are less specialized and can be pollinated by many different things. They have become phenomenally successful, and they outcompeted the gymnosperms largely over much of the Earth's surface. The gymnosperms became isolated to areas such as the forests up in the north, the boreal forests, those kinds of places, and they were effectively outcompeted by the flowering plants. So this is the basic structure. I'm just going to stop for 1 minute so you don't have to listen to me blow my nose. Okay, I'm back again. So this is a basic structure of a flower. This is a relatively simple flower, something like a lily, something like that. And already you can see it has much more complex anatomy than the relatively simple anatomy of the cones of the gymnosperms. Flowers are usually borne on a stalk, and there is one set of, these are all specialized leaves that surround the reproductive structures. These here are called the sepals, and the sepals in some plants are small, green, like this. In others, the sepals are much bigger and look very much like the petals. Just depends on the plant. These are the petals here. Petals are specialized for attracting pollinators. And they, depending on what the pollinator is, they usually have markings or something like that, which serve as information for the pollinators to bring them in to the correct parts of the plant to effect fertilization. So the male parts of the plant are called the stamens. And this is them here. They usually have a stalk called the filament, which lifts them up and above the level of the petals. This part here is the part which is actually going to act as the sporangium, because it's in this part here that meiosis is going to occur to produce the to produce the pollen, which the pollen is Microsporangium is going to contain the male Gametophyte. The pollen, just as it was in the Gymnosperms, is a huge advance because the pollen can be transported a long distance away from its parent. It can be transported to another plant to increase genetic diversity. And this is very advantageous. Here are the female parts of the plant here. And I'll just take you here first of all, because this is the ovule. This is the equivalent of the ovule that we saw sitting on the leaf of the Gymnosperm, on the specialized reproductive leaf of the Gymnosperm in the cone. This is the ovule. So it contains Megasporangium surrounded by a protective integument. But here it is here, and there may be lots of them, and they are enclosed in a protective structure called the ovary. But the problem with this is, of course, that it isolates the Megasporangium and the megaspore and then the egg from the outside. But it protects it within this whole structure here, and there is another point to the structure, as we'll see. So somehow or other, the pollen has to, the sperm have to find their way to each of these eggs contained in each ovule. The way they do it is by having the pollen attach here. The pollen lands here on this receptive surface here, which is called the stigma. And the pollen actually germinates and produces a pollen tube, which grows all the way down here. It grows all the way around here, all the way up here. And then each pollen tube enters the ovule and is going to fertilize the ovule. It's quite an undertaking. So the pollen lands here, grows all the way down here, all the way around, all the way up and into each ovule. You have to have a separate pollen grain germinating for each of these ovules. So the whole thing, the stigma, the style, which is this column that the pollen has to grow through, and then the ovary itself is referred to as the carpel there. So that is the basic structure of the flower, of a flowering plant. But that all of these structures here can contribute to the production of the other characteristic of the flowering plants, and that is an elaborate fruit. Fruits can be formed in many different ways, but some of them, for example, almost all of them rather, are formed from an elaboration of the ovary together with the ovule in the center. Sometimes there are separate ovaries with an ovule inside, just one. Many times there are many ovules within an ovary. And fruits can be elaborations, both of the ovary and then of other parts of the plant as well. But either way, the flowering plants are characterized by the production of a fruit, which is usually not only contains a lot of nutrient for a growing embryo, but is attractive to animals which may disperse it. Very frequently, a fruit will contain seeds in the center, which are protected by a seed coat, which is often derived from the walls, from the ovule walls, etc., but surrounded by a fleshy covering, which is attractive to animals. The animals eat the fleshy covering, do not digest the seeds, but go far away from the parent plant to poop out the seeds where they can germinate. So, for example, all of these, the tomato, things like the grapefruit, nectarines, all of these are fruits. So are all the nuts here. The nuts are here. This is the actual ovary wall that sort of forms that seed coat around the nut. Other seeds are specialized to be dispersed by wind. Here's a seed here. The rest of this was the ovary there. And the ovule has developed to protect the seed, but also to produce all of these fine hairs which will carry the seed. It's a huge specialization and a huge advantage for the plant to produce these seeds. They use all sorts of elaborate methods for dispersal. Some of them are wind dispersed. They have just rather like we saw in the gymnosperms, they have produced these wings, which are aerodynamically active, which allow them to spiral away from the plant. Many are transported by animals. Others are transported by animals inadvertently because they have hooks and barbs on them, which catch on the animal's fur and transport the whole. This, by the way, is the whole ovary there. And the whole ovary has developed these spikes. The ovary will ultimately open up to drop the seeds from it. So the other thing about the flowering plants is that they have a very, very elaborate fertilization process. And it is called double fertilization. We do see hints of it in the gymnosperms. I didn't discuss it, but I'll just tell you that there are some gymnosperms which don't have the same process, but we can see hints of it. And so this is probably a reflection of common ancestry between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. But in the angiosperms and the flowering plants, it is actually quite an elaborate process. So I'll just explain to you that here, this was our Megasporangium, and here inside, we actually have the megaspore. And the megaspore is formed from meiotic division of Megasporangium cell. And the initial division is meiotic. So meiosis, you'll remember, produces 4 progeny cells. So there are 4 progeny cells produced. Each of those cells undergoes mitosis. And we end up with 8 cells, and they are all N. They're all haploid, and here they are here, 1, 2, 3. Here, this is a single cell, but it has 2 nuclei, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 nuclei produced from meiosis, around a meiosis and around a mitosis. So these are all N. This here is the actual egg cell there in the center. I'll tell you the names, but you don't need to remember them. These are called the synergids, these on either side. These are called the antipodal cells. These here, do remember, they are called the polar cells. And you can see there's 2 of them, 2 nuclei, but no cell wall between them. So these are the polar nuclei. Remember that the pollen landed, and it has to grow all the way down the style, and it ends up here, entering the ovule here. Here's the ovule wall. And in fact, the pollen grain contains the male gametophyte, which produces 2 sperm. And here they are here. 1 sperm goes to fertilize this egg here. This other sperm goes to unite with these 2 nuclei, 1, 2, 3. Now remember something, everything's N. Okay, so sperm N, egg N, that forms a 2N zygote. This one sperm here unites with these, so it's N plus N plus N. It ends up forming a cell which is 3N. It is triploid, and that cell rapidly divides. The cells are enormous, and they rapidly divide to form a nutrient surrounding to the embryo. This is going to form the embryo. This here is going to crowd out all of the other cells, and it's going to form a rich embryo, a rich endosperm, a nutrient substance for the embryo. So this is called double fertilization. Double because it fertilizes the egg, it fertilizes the egg, and it fertilizes the endosperm as well. These other cells, excuse me, these other cells here are all lost as the endosperm grows. What we end up with is an embryo, again, an embryo in the center, surrounded by a nutrient layer, the endosperm, surrounded by a seed coat produced by the wall of the ovary. And then, the wall of the ovule, rather. And then that is contained within the ovary, and the ovary itself may be elaborated to further form the fruit. So I said that many of them are wind pollinated. Excuse me, I'm just going to stop for I'm sorry. Look at me, I'm all purple. Any case, I told you many of the flowering plants are still fertilized by wind. And here's one of the most familiar. This is corn, Zia Maize, its name is in Latin. And but it uses exactly the same kind of structures. And so here, this whole thing here is actually the ovary. It has many ovules. And they are, each ovule is attached to a stigma. And the stigma in pollen, in corn rather, forms the silks. Each silk leads down to an ovule. And the pollen is produced by a separate flowering part of the corn plant, which is terminal, which produces masses of pollen. The pollen is wind carried, and each ovule, each of the corns that we need to eat, is fertilized by one pollen grain, which has to grow all the way down these silks. In the case of the ones at the bottom, it has to grow all the way down, send the pollen tube all the way down to fertilize each ovule there. In addition, there are elaborations of the leaves and everything to wrap around the whole structure to further protect it. And that's our corn cob. But the amazing thing is each one, an ovule, each one has its own stigma and has to, the pollen has to grow all the way down to it. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there for the main reason that I can't really carry on much longer. But I will complete this section in another recorded class once my voice has recovered a bit. And please go through these before we start again on Monday. Okay.